Hello, it is Lucky, and I am back with a shading tutorial, except it's more in depth this time and actually semi-scripted. So today I will be showing you what to do and also what not to do. Let's start off with what not to do because that'll lead into what you should do. So I see a lot of people, they'll just fill the entire character with black and then just start erasing away where it sticks out, like we're only going to shade the face for time's sake. So they just shade whatever sticks out. They either use the airbrush or they do what I'm doing now and then blur tool it later. I'm going to just finish this up. So then they blur it like that. And then in a similar way, they'd add highlights. They always use black or a darker or white or gray for some reason here. They never use like any other colors, which is weird, but hey, whatever works for them, I guess. So they do the same thing for highlights. They blur it. And then they lower the opacity. And so you'd get something like that, which there are a lot of things wrong with this. They don't have a light source, so the shading really doesn't look natural. They use black, white, or gray, or colors very close to them, so it washes out the colors and makes everything look dull. It looks the airbrush makes it look unnatural and like plastic or something that just isn't realistic, and if you put this, and they usually lower the opacity a lot, so if you actually I'm gonna just merge this folder temporarily for comparison sake. When you put it in black and white, there really isn't that much of a color difference, which isn't good when you're trying to shade something. I am going to re-merge this folder now. This is really not a good way to shade. However, there are good ways to shade. There are ways to fix this. We're going to address shading colors first. So, the color of your shading makes a big difference how interesting this shading looks. So, this is Bartol's main shade, per se. We want to pick a complementary color for the complementary tone. What is a complementary tone? A tone on the opposite side of the color wheel. Here is our handy color wheel. So for reddish tones, this would be a bluish tone. For a purplish tone, this would be a greenish tone. For a pinkish tone, this would be another greenish tone, so on and so forth. So we are going to pick this bluish tone. This is the complementary color. And for a shading color, I tend to pick a range around there. And then I would go in, I would set the layer I'm shading on multiply, and look at how much more interesting that looks already. We haven't even started shading yet. It looks so much better than if you were to shade it with black. And I am going to make and for comparison's sake, I am going to, this is black shading, this is blue shading. Looks so much more interesting with the blue shading. You can do similar things for highlights, where you'd also pick a complementary color, but instead you would put it around here as a lighter color, and then you would set the layer on overlay instead. Some people don't use overlays. Some people might use add, but I just prefer overlay. And then, so then you would just shade, I'm just going to shade the muzzle because I'm lazy. It looks way more interesting than if you did with blue and lighter blue than if you used black. if you used black and white. If you used black and white, it looks a lot more blue, and a lighter blue looks a lot more interesting than if you just used black and white. So, and then as for airbrush blur shading, if you still want soft shading, but you don't want but use airbrush, well, the airbrush doesn't look that great, but if you still want soft shading, I would suggest using a different brush, like, that is not the correct layer, okay. So, if you wanted, there are a lot of different brushes in the program I use, which is Medibang Paint. This is the fluffy watercolor brush, third one. There is the crayon brush, which obviously looks like crayon. There is the oil watercolor brush, which doesn't come with which you can't download from the cloud and doesn't come from the program. I got these brush settings from someone else, and I will link from who in the description. So I'm just going to use the oil watercolor brush here, so when you shade, it still looks sort of soft. You can also use the mix. Usually I'd just go in and then I'd use the mix brush to just blend it out more. I'm gonna make the shading opacity, and I would use white here, which helps blend it out, and then you have this nice shading. Crap, wrong layer. The light source is going to be from the right, so I am going to do a demonstration. So when you shade, so your light is coming from the right. A light source is basically the direction where the light is coming from. So when you shade according to this light source, you would take your brush and then you would put the darks or shadows on the right side of the character like that. Remember to shade each part individually and don't shade the entire thing as a whole. I mean, you can, but it generally helps me to take it one body part at a time. So then it helps to have a tablet here since it's way easier to mix colors. You can also cell shade, but if you still want the shading soft, you can do something like this. So when you're shading, I'm just gonna shade the arm here for quickness sake. So you can see where the shading is coming from. The light is coming from. We are not shading the left side because that is where the light is. Shadows naturally would not appear there. So there we go. We have Bartol's arm is shaded. So we would take a lighter color. We'd go on an overlay layer. We can turn this up higher. We can turn this up higher while we're shading. We can screw around with the opacity later. So we are adding the highlights on the left side like that. And then you lower the opacity, and then you have this lovely shaded arm. Make sure when you're shading that you follow the general curve of the body. So don't shade like, say, I'm going to use the other arm now. Don't shade like that if you're like doing an arm. That looks unnatural and weird, and it doesn't exactly follow the outline. So when you're shading, it's a better idea to follow the curve or outline of the body and more like that. So that is how shading works. And also what I mentioned about the contrast earlier, you can fix this either by turning up the opacity I am going to merge this. I'm gonna delete these. Crap. Gonna delete these. And then I am going to merge the folder again. So now that the opacity is turned up, and I mean not the opacity, the opacity is turned up, you can see that there is a lot higher contrast in the shadows, so when you turn it to black and white, it looks a lot more visually interesting than it was before. And that, my dear viewers, is how you shade. I'm going to link a bunch of other helpful stuff in the description that probably gets to the point better and doesn't ramble as much as I do. And I'm also going to link any references I commonly use while shading, because references are your friend. Use references, they'll save your life. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. If you want other tutorials, just request them in the description. I mean, not description, comments. I'm probably going to do a painting tutorial one day, but that's for another time. Goodbye. Crap.